Alright, so I decided to draft this book 2 times ago. Do you want me to read the entire thing? Why the hell not? Forward. Legend of Blackbridge is one that's well known to the people of the Grand Realm, for versions of this tale have been passed down from generation to generation. With each new telling, the story has changed, becoming over the years more colorful, more verbose, and as one might expect, increasingly horrifying. However, with so many renditions and unique personal touches, the task of confining and binding this tale to text seemed an ambitious and impossible challenge. Over the course of my research, I have heard dozens of variations of the legend, and while the details would often change, I was surprised how much of the story's heart remained the same. Yet, the more I listened, the clearer it became that there could never be a definitive version of this tale capable of capturing all the wonder and myth of Black Bridge. In the end, I chose to write down what felt most authentic, the story my grandmother told me as a boy long ago. Part 1: The Berry Picker from Horace. Many years ago, before peace had become a familiar word, there lived a group of rogues so wayward that the locals deemed it appropriate to call their number the Unholy Hounds. They were feral outlaws composed of society's worst in a time when society was at its worst, and for each crime that fearful travelers credited to the group, a dozen more lay unclaimed, each more worse than the last. For the gentry, however, who often value their coffers more than their companions, no crime can measure more wicked than the group's primary enterprise: high road robbery. One such member of this so-called band of rogues is a boy of 13 years, Jesper, who had not been who had not been lucky in life, having lost two brothers to war and parents to famine. The years of hunger that followed, Jesper lived in a gutter behind a churchyard, relying on the nourishment of scurrying bugs and harvest cracks of the alleyway to sustain his pitiful existence. It is not surprising that a child aiming to escape such hardships would take an road out. An easy and well-traveled road paved with temptations leading out of the city and into the gentry lands where loose purse strings twine with the strands of salvation and glisten equally with the hope of opportunity. It was this road that eventually led Jesper to the end of his youth, a hidden cave at the bottom of Blackbridge Canyon. It was here that he met his surrogate family and saviors, the notorious gang of godless outlaws known as the Unholy Hounds. Despite the hardened circumstances that had led him to this vocation of banditry, Jesper was surprisingly tender-hearted and was often teased by the group for being too kind for such an ignoble life. For this reason, Jesper was assigned the innocent role of berry picker. It was not just innocence that set berry picking apart from the gang's more wicked undertaking, for it was the only duty performed without the safety of night's concealment. Jesper, no stranger to solitude, did not protest when he alone worked while others slept soundly, tucked away in the cave at the bottom of Blackbridge Canyon. On one such occasion, Jesper decided to get an early start, left the cave berry basket in hand, and set out into the woods before the morning sun had even brushed against the tallest treetops. It was colder in the mornings, but the headway dawn afforded meant Jesper could reach the furthermost berry patches without worry of being chastised for tearing upon his return. Took
Alright, guys, I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Good night, Jenny.
We're gonna have Zentine speak.
Good night, Jenny.
Good night.
It took over 3 hours on foot to reach his destination, and along the way, Jesper had passed by many a familiar bush, all priorly pillaged and so bereft of berries that one would have to dedicate several moments in earnest examination before finding a single one. Jesper was patient, but even patience has its limits. He was confident that even accounting for the time lost to this long stretch of travel, his efforts would be well worth the pains. Surveying the patches in this new grove surprised even Jesper. The red dots suspended among the leaves seemed as numerous as stars in the skies. Upon seeing such a bounteous sight, he clutched his berry basket tightly and nearly toppled over out of joy. Once he had regained his senses, Jesper quickly made a decision. He would not reveal the location of this newfound treasure. Instead, he would earn the respect of his confederates, who, upon seeking his yield, would attribute the success to hard work. Smiling at his plan, Jesper set off to fill his basket and was making steady strides in this task when the sound of thundering hooves interrupted him. A carriage! A carriage is approaching! The thought of it made Jesper freeze. Had he been so enchanted by his discovery that he had neglected to observe his surroundings? How could a roadway be so close? He ducked down and crept toward the impending sound, hiding behind one of the larger bushes nearby. It was only a moment before the sound's source revealed itself. Within 50 paces where Jesper hid, an elegant carriage with gold trim came soaring around a corner of trees, led by two beautiful white horses and conveyed by a stern-looking driver seated atop the vehicle, flaunting the most sophisticated regalia Jesper had ever seen. It was not just any carriage, it was a royal carriage. Even without ever having witnessed such a sight before, Jesper was certain. The sight had so transfixed Jesper that he stood awestruck, unable to tear away as the carriage approached. The little concealment the bush provided was soon proven unequal to the driver's lofty perch, and upon spotting the boy, he pulled the reins with such effect that the noble steed slid to a sudden halt with precise control. "You, boy, get out from behind that bush," he shouted with a rigidity that betrayed a modest amount of fear. "You startled me half to death coming around the bend of my own drive and seeing such an unfamiliar face in a place where there ought not to be any face." Jesper quickly contemplated running. The man was much older and his dress was suitable for courtly behavior, not dashing through the bramble and mud. I was picking berries." Jesper raised the half-filled basket up to allow the driver to see the proof of his words. The demeanor of the man suddenly changed. It was a change that Jesper was familiar with. He had many times seen the same stern expressions on the most fiendish bandits melt away when presented with a berry basket. Any suspicions that the driver might have had instantly evaporated, for even the notion of a member of the unholy hounds picking berries seemed farcical. The softened expression even made allowances for a smile. "Berries, eh? Say, couldn't have picked a better spot for them, could you? I used to pick berries here as a boy." Jesper took his cue to finally step forward out from behind the bush, proudly brandishing his basket. "I know, look, I found them. I have only just begun picking, and look how many I have. It would have taken me fourfold the time back home to procure this number." The driver bent down for a closer look. "Where's your home, boy? It must be quite far?" Jesper replied with a scripted response. "A little south of Tanner Fork, just past the burnt woods." "My God, that is far. You couldn't have come all that way only this morning." It was true, Tanner Fork was in the exact opposite direction that Jesper had traveled, and while that response would seem perfectly reasonable, in a location closer to Blackbridge Canyon, he could see why it might seem less believable here. "Sir, I have traveled much farther for much less profit. I dare say there is no distance yet made by man that would not be worth undertaking for a price such as these." "Surely you have tasted them for yourself?" Jesper felt happier with this response as it seemed to amplify the man's smile. "In my youth, often, but perhaps I took it for granted because I never had to travel very far. Even then, my father would always drive us here in our carriage, so I'm ashamed I never had to walk such a stretch to earn an equal reward." It was Jesper's turn to smile. "Then let my efforts reward us both today." He raised the basket even higher. "A taste in memory of your youth, sir." The driver chuckled and removed one glove, bending over to the seat to reach down to the basket. At the moment his fingers touched the first berry, the dagger in turn met his throat, cutting through a superficial layer of skin and drawing blood. Jesper caught the man's startled eyes. "And for that taste, I will have your purse, sir, in memory of my youth." The driver's arm had gone stiff, his chin raised and trembling, more frightened than he had ever been in before. Whether unable or incapable of speaking, he did not respond to the boy. Perhaps he did not think his jaw could afford to be engaged at this particular time. Jesper let the basket drop, freeing his other hand to probe the man's pockets. "Do not mistake me, sir. I will kill you. I will not kill you if you give me no cause. Though I will admit the thought of taking your carriage and leaving you the indignity of walking appeals to me." Unable to find a purse in the man's coat, Jesper pivoted to search the seat under him. "Why have you no purse upon your person?" The driver slowly raised his hand cautiously, pointing toward the carriage door behind him. Jesper lowered the knife's edge a small degree to allow the man to speak, which he did in turn softly. "There's a lockbox in the carriage." "Well, come down then, and grant me the courtesy of sparing your life and binding your hands, a concession, I assure you, of my tender heart, for it would be much easier to slit your throat." The man started to comply, slowly lowering himself from the driver's seat of the carriage. Once down, Jesper guided him away from the carriage to a nearby tree where he instructed him to get on his knees and put his hands behind his back. Excusing his inexperience, the man indulged Jesper while he figured out how to adequately bind him. The smile and kindness Jesper had seen on this man's face now nothing more than a distant memory. In their place, cold, dark eyes displayed no emotion. I wonder, should I grant you the same clemency you were showing me? Jesper stopped, surprised by the question, but ignored it, secured the final bindings, and then hastily returned to the carriage. With one hand on the door's handle, he turned back to the man. If there is no lockbox, there will be no clemency. Inside, the carriage was surprisingly dusty and unswept, a stark contrast to the elegant and polished golden facade of the exterior. It had apparently been many years since a passenger had enjoyed a passage in this vehicle. This all but confirmed what Jesper had suspected. The driver of this carriage was not a livered servant in the employ of some greater master. Any curiosity that this observation might have further produced was quickly abandoned upon seeing what rested under the carriage's back seat, a large wooden lockbox. Despite its hefty appearance, the box was surprisingly easy to handle. Within a few minutes, Jesper had dislodged it from its hold and carried it out into the sunlight. Inspecting the box carefully, 2 observations were made. Totemic symbols found carved on all 4 sides of the box hinted that the box was very old and likely not created by Orindian hands. Reminded him of artifacts from the old world and was presumably crafted in one of the ancient realms. Secondly, the box was secured by a rusted yet robust padlock and would not open easily without a key. Jesper looked over to see the driver quietly observing him from his indentured position. You perhaps have a key that you provide me to open this box. Without emotion, the driver replied, there is no key to that box. Jesper stood up. Easy enough, then. He headed over to a nearby rock of sizable dimensions and lifted the stone up, carrying it back to the box. If there was ever a time when that lock had been resistant to brute force, it wasn't recent. With one hit, the stone had completely shattered the rusted lock. He bent back down and opened the lid. Inside was an effigy, a crude figure chiseled from stone. Without too much deliberation, Jesper bent down and picked it up, somewhat surprised how heavy it seemed given how light the box had felt. Having expected to find something more akin to gold or gems, he looked questioningly to the man hoping to find an explanation. The driver's smile had once again returned. You are cursed, boy, for deadly is the stone. You have opened that which should have never been opened, and you are cursed. Jesper carried the effigy over to the man and shoved it in front of his face. What is it? That's one. Feeling his disappointment rising to anger now, Jesper tightened his grip on the effigy. One what, you mumbling egentor? And in God's name, why have you no purse upon your person? The man did not seem intimidated. 1 pace. He paused for effect. 12 more and you will be dead. He only had a second to flinch before the effigy struck him in the head and put an end to his cryptic ramblings. If there was ever a time when the old man had been resistant to brute force, it wasn't recent. Jesper looked down at the sculpted stone figure now splattered red. Was it cursed? Was he cursed? He had, of course, heard stories of curses and had never doubted their validity in the past, but now he was standing face to face with the possibility of being cursed. His mind pleaded with him to be skeptical. If he was cursed? What difference would the knowledge make? A dozen more paces would not be enough to find another living soul, to say nothing of the chances of procuring a remedy. If he did not move from where he stood, he could live maybe another 3 or 4 days, maybe more given the abundance of nearby berries. Plan that if we ignore to its obvious faults might provide additional opportunities for help to come along. But what good would that do? Be discovered here. Beside a body, stolen goods in hand, bloated from berries and raving about a curse that could very well not be real. No, it would most certainly be better to face one's fate now, take a dozen paces and see if life goes on. But Jesper found his legs unable to make that first step. His mind was unable to convince his limb to waste 1/12 of his life in a single motion. Feeling the desperation sink in, he hopelessly looked around him for a solution. And if, by some stroke of luck, the gods had heard his pleas, a miracle materialized before him as if found himself suddenly at the end of a fairy tale. 2 white horses and a carriage of golden trim were beside him, the answer to his immediate prayers. He laughed at his fortune, calculated the short number of paces back to the road. 4. Perhaps only 3 if he jumped. He made a quick survey to see if there was anything he wished to grab before taking his plunge. He thought about removing the driver's fancy coat, as that appeared to be of some value, but the additional risk of undertaking such a task too great to chance. And so, after a profound breath, he took his second, third, and fourth step, though they were quite large. Seated now behind the horses, he reached for the reins and suddenly realized that he was still gripping the effigy. If the curse was real, then it would most certainly be better left here. If, on the other hand, the story was fictitious, there might be some appraisal that could be made of the figure. It was, after all, found within a lockbox whose typical function of oft secures object of value. Having witnessed firsthand the horrors of destitution, Jesper found his mind equally reluctant to allow his hand let go. If it is cursed, I die. If not today, then tomorrow. And if I die, what care have I? And with that statement said aloud, to the horses, seemingly, Jesper took up the reins with confidence. I will be right back. I believe there is 5 parts to this book, so you're in for a treat. I'm going to continue reading. There's actually 5 parts of this. Part 2, Below the Black Bridge. Miller awoke to some light nudging from a familiar foot. I actually am enjoying this. Only one person would have the cheek to awaken her in such an ill-mannered fashion. Shaking the sleep from her eyes, she glared up at him in the darkness, but did not say a word. He nudged her again teasingly, then stepped back into the dim. After taking a moment for her eyes to adjust to the darkness of the cave, Miller remembered. She was on third watch today. Quietly collecting her things and wits, Miller turned as she left, waving to her young friend who was more than likely already asleep. She crept through the cavern's main passage, careful to not wake the sleeping bandits around her, like a hero in a book she often used. Quietly, she grabbed a bow from the haphazardly formed pile of weapons, shaking the accompanying quiver in the darkness to assess how many arrows it held. She then walked toward the sun-drenched mouth of the cavern, ready to start her shift. Above her, in one of the few trees found in the canyon, Miller could see that Ravia already posted. She waved, and Ravia waved back. Calling out to each other was strictly forbidden. Anything louder than a gesture in the canyon was forbidden. When Miller reached the tree, Ravia lowered a braided rope and pointed to the ground behind her. Miller turned, following the finger, and saw a pail of water resting beside a nearby log. He turned back to Ravia, nodded, and secured the pail to the rope. The pail went up first, and in turn Miller followed. Ravia reached across to grab the water. Miller leaned back to give her space. There was not much room for maneuvering in this tree post, a necessary concession for the concealment the outpost demanded. Ravia tilted the pail up to her mouth dramatically, illustrating how thirsty she had been. Miller laughed silently as the water poured out, splashing onto Ravia's face. It was a bit too daring and noisy of a joke, and had the others been around, they would have certainly been scolded. for the unwarranted sound. But Miller appreciated the efforts Ravia took to verbalize the silence of the morning. They had been on third watch together for over a month, and during that speechless time, their friendship had grown into something special. Affection was unsurprisingly scarce among the unholy hounds. She had felt camaraderie before, of course, but intimacy never. From their elevated vantage, the girls could both see the concealed entrance of the cavern as well as a clear view of the bridge that spanned across the canyon. Black Bridge was the link between the Gentry lands and the northern mountains, the overpass that connected Orris and Reddington. The city-faring travelers of the realm, the bridge was an unavoidable crossing. In the day, the task was to ensure the travelers passed by without stopping. At night, the task was to ensure that they do. Like most of her band, Miller preferred the night. The biting glare of the sun might be tolerable to farmhands and bricklayers, but to a cavern-house bandit, it was a source of constant annoyance. In the day, there was no shroud to conceal her expressions, nor to hide her thoughts. She felt exposed. Ravia touched her elbow and pointed up. Miller, striving to suppress a budding smile, subtly shook her head in response. There were many signs that the unholy hounds used in lieu of words, but the two of them had developed an extended vocabulary. Gestures quietly forged in the shared solitude of their month among the branches. She watched as Ravia shifted, placing her palms flat on the floorboards beneath them. Miller knew what she was trying to say, but shook her head for a second time. It was often more fun to pretend not to understand. Ravia rolled her eyes and turned away, looking back to the canyon. Squinting through the leaves, the two girls held still, watching and listening. It was not long until Miller, too, heard the sounds of approach. Ravia held up two bent fingers, and a few moments later, two men emerged from the bridge's southern end. They were dressed in a familiar uniform, long gray coats with black facings, white waistcoats, and black tricorn hats. They belonged to the local patrol, the Blackguard. Although not an everyday occurrence, their presence at Blackbridge wasn't an unusual sight. It typically indicated an important traveler's impending passage across the bridge, information that the girls would promptly relay to their leaders as soon as the coast was clear. But this report, while exciting, was rarely acted upon. In Miller's 5 years in the Unholy Hounds, she had never once seen a carriage taken in open daylight when the Blackguard was by. The men had nearly reached the bridge's north end when Miller heard the horses. Faintly at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. Ravia's eyes met Miller's, the same concern mirrored in each other's expressions. This did not sound like the typical carriage cautiously approaching the bridge to cross. Instead of the familiar crunch of the high road's gravel, they heard the harsh clattering of hoofbeats against stone. Both girls quickly redirected their attention downwards, looking through the foliage. Sounds were not coming from the high road, but from the canyon itself, the horses coming from below the bridge. In an instant, Miller had knocked an arrow and drawn her bow. Go! Ravia was gone before the whisper had even left Miller's mouth. The young scout was already sliding down the bank below, racing toward the cave. There was no road that ran below the canyon. There was no reason for numerous horses to be approaching their cave. There was only one reasonable conclusion, and both girls had reached it instantly. The base had been compromised. This was a Blackguard attack. The moment the horses came into view, Miller let loose her first arrow. She was surprised to see a carriage. She had expected cavalry, but before she had even finished processing that thought, her second arrow was in the air. Without a trail, it would be unthinkable for a carriage to traverse such rough terrain, yet she watched as the wheels jolted over the rocky riverbed. A third arrow was now in flight, and there would be no need for a fourth. The driver slumped over just moments before the vehicle dipped into a small ditch, slamming into an embankment. The force of the sudden halt immediately shattered the two front wheels and catapulted the driver from his seat. Utterly confused now, Miller quickly glanced over her shoulder to see if any horses were also approaching from the rear. Down in the canyon, the entire horde of the unholy hounds came spilling forth from the earth as if hell itself had suddenly sprung open. The group seemed even more bewildered than Miller, half asleep and tripping over one another in a desperate attempt to engage an unseen enemy in combat. Miller could see that Ravia was among their number, the only one looking up at her. Her expression was chilling. There would be no need for a silent gesture to convey what they both now realized. They had made a mistake. The gang's chieftain, Jeffrey Heartslasher, led the others, cautiously approaching the crashed carriage like a suspicious fox would near a baited trap. There were no words exchanged as the group crept forward in customary silence. A dozen or so paces in front of the wreckage lay the far-flung driver, an arrow protruding from his broken body, and beside him a blood-stained effigy carved from stone. Miller was inconsolable. Jesper had always been her favorite. He had always shadowed her in the night, clinging to the hems of her every move, the way a child tails behind an older sibling. Tender-hearted, she had always called him, though deep down she had known that wasn't quite true. His appearance of gentleness concealed a raw, resilient durability that emerged in the most perilous of situations. He had been a flower among the nettles of this cave, but he had thorns, honed by a grim past and 100 hands of misfortune. They buried him in the darkness in the back of one of the larger cavern rooms. He was interred with a berry basket and a silk handkerchief that he had treasured. The mysterious effigy they had found beside him served as a distinguished gravestone, marker that stood out as somewhat special among the rows of similar swords marking neighboring plots. No one spoke, not even in whispers. There was nothing to say. Miller awoke the next day to a thunderous shaking and rattling of the earth, a far cry from the playful nudging of the previous day. She strained to adjust her eyes, but the choking sting of the stirred-up dust caused her to flinch. Panic was also in the air. The sounds of scurried footsteps and clattering feet filled the space around her. But even in alarm, the silence was louder. What was it that sounded so strange? Miller closed her eyes tight and used her feet to guide her along the passage. The whispers around her were getting louder, and intense voices could be heard aloud. Louder speech than she had ever heard spoken in the canon. A growing dread grew as Miller approached the mouth of the cave. Her eyes now opened wide despite the dust. Shouldn't it be day? Miller felt a hand in the darkness pulling at her. It was Ravia. The two embraced, and Miller did not need to see her to understand. Ravia placed two bent fingers against Miller's cheek. With that touch against her face, Miller felt the same sinking feeling from the previous day. Two bent fingers confirmed what Miller had suspected. The girls had forgotten to relay one critical piece of information to the others. An hour or so later, the screams began, blood-curdling cries of hopeless desperation. Captain Fordick Lee of the Blackguard looked down from the ridge of the canyon to the collapsed entrance to the cave. "Ah," he grinned, "now they speak."